My name is Victoria. I am 28 years old. Hours after I pushed my first child into the world, my mother leaned over my hospital bed, squinted at my newborn son, and announced to the entire maternity ward that he did not belong to my husband. I didn't deliver a calm, mature response. I grabbed a plastic water pitcher from my bedside table and hurled it at her. It bounced off the wall, spilling ice and water everywhere. But I am an operations coordinator. I organize supply chains for a living. I never react without a paper trail. While the ice was still melting on the linoleum, I pulled a sealed manila envelope from my hospital bag and handed over the certified DNA test my husband and I had kept hidden for 3 months. Before I take you back to that delivery room, take a second to like and subscribe to Sofia Told Stories and drop a comment telling me your age and where you are watching from right now. The air in the St. Paul hospital room smelled of harsh antiseptic and exhaustion. My arms shook with the fragile weight of my son. My husband Eric stood right beside me, his large hands resting on my shoulder. He manages logistics on the Lake Superior freighters, navigating icy waters and spending weeks away from home. He looked drained but radiant. His conservative Scandinavian parents stood quietly near the door, holding a blue knit blanket, waiting for their turn to meet their grandson. Then my mother Linda walked in. She did not bring flowers. She did not offer congratulations. The nurses had barely finished wiping the afterbirth from my baby's skin when Linda pushed her way to the rail of the bed. She stared down at the infant. She scrutinized his features, then turned her gaze toward Eric. "Well, the timeline does not make sense," my mother projected. Her voice was loud enough to carry through the open door and down the hallway. "That is not Eric's child." The nurses froze. Eric's parents stiffened, the blue blanket dropping slightly in his mother's hands. I wanted to be the bigger person. I wanted to rise above her cruelty. Instead, postpartum hormones and raw fury took over. I grabbed the heavy hospital pitcher and threw it hard. The plastic cracked against the drywall right next to Linda's head. Water drenched her beige cardigan. "Get out!" I screamed, my voice cracking under the strain. Linda gasped, brushing the water off her chest, assuming she had caught me in a lie. She looked toward Eric's parents, expecting them to side with her. She expected my husband to demand answers. She did not realize we had been waiting for this exact moment. My hands trembled as I unzipped the front pocket of my duffel bag. I bypassed the nursing pads and the extra socks. I pulled out a heavy manila envelope with a red laboratory stamp across the flap. I didn't hand it to my mother. I held it out to Eric's mother. Eric and I had taken a non-invasive prenatal paternity test months earlier. We sat at our kitchen table and opened the results together. We cried in relief, not because we doubted each other, but because we knew my mother was building a narrative to destroy us. We ordered a certified copy and sealed it, knowing Linda would inevitably try to stage a public ambush. Eric's mother broke the seal. She pulled out the crisp white paper. She read the bold text stating a 99.9% probability of paternity. She looked at Linda, her expression hardening into pure, unvarnished disgust. The charge nurse stepped between my mother and my bed. She pressed a button on the wall intercom requesting security. Linda's arrogant posture crumbled. The color drained from her cheeks as 2 security guards arrived in the doorway. They flanked my mother and instructed her to leave the premises. I watched them escort her down the corridor, her wet cardigan dripping onto the polished hospital floor. The paperwork shut down her ambush before it could even begin, but the DNA test was only a temporary shield. My mother's humiliation in that maternity ward set the stage for a much colder, calculated retaliation. I thought I had won the war, but I was about to find out that proving my innocence was only the first step in uncovering a 30-year-old lie. To understand why a pregnant woman packs a sealed forensic document alongside her nursing bras, you have to rewind the clock. Let me take you back 6 months to the day we shared our pregnancy news. My husband Eric is not a man who works a standard office job. He is a logistics manager on the Lake Superior freighters. His career dictates a rugged, unconventional rhythm for our lives. He spends 4-week rotations out on the dark, open water, guiding iron ore shipments through treacherous shipping channels. The physical distance is a heavy burden. When he steps off those colossal ships and returns to dry land, we cherish our limited time together. We planned for this child, carefully tracking his shore leaves and coordinating our schedules. When the home pregnancy test finally showed a positive result, we were ecstatic. We invited my parents over to our house to celebrate the milestone. I spent the afternoon baking lemon bars and brewing fresh coffee. I arranged the living room expecting tears of joy and warm embraces. Instead, my mother Linda sat on the edge of the sofa and set her ceramic mug onto a cork coaster. She tilted her head and offered a tight, thin smile that failed to reach her eyes. She did not congratulate us. She chose to weaponize our regional culture of extreme politeness. In our part of the country, we call it Minnesota nice. It is the dark art of delivering a devastating insult wrapped in a cheerful sing-song tone. Linda looked directly at Eric and remarked on our miracle timing, considering his prolonged absences on the lakes. She turned her gaze to me and asked highly specific, invasive questions about the male colleagues at my operations firm. She wondered aloud who kept me company during those lonely weeks while my husband was away navigating the ice. Her tone was light and conversational, but her words were laced with venom. I brushed the comments aside, assuming she was just being thoughtless. I failed to realize she was planting seeds in a carefully curated garden of doubt. Those seeds sprouted with terrifying speed. My mother serves as a central pillar in our local Lutheran church community. She volunteers for the weekly bake sales and organizes the seasonal charity drives. She leveraged her social position to cultivate a toxic narrative. Within a few weeks, women from the congregation began appearing on my front porch. They carried aluminum pans of tater-tot hottish and wild rice casseroles, framing their visits as charity for an expectant mother. But their generosity always carried a hidden agenda. These women lingered in my doorway, adjusting their heavy winter scarves and prying for details about Eric's shipping schedule. They casually calculated dates out loud, questioning the timeline of my conception. The whispers did not stay confined to the church pews. They leaped across family lines, reaching Eric's extended relatives. His stern German-American mother, who had always treated me with warmth, grew noticeably cold during our Sunday dinners. She stopped asking about the nursery preparations. She avoided eye contact. She had been influenced by the insidious rumors leaking out of my mother's influential social circle. The toxicity finally breached the walls of my marriage in late January. Eric returned home from a particularly grueling rotation on the lakes. A fierce winter storm had blanketed our neighborhood. We stood together in our driveway, surrounded by 3 feet of fresh snow. The air was sharp and bitter, biting at our exposed skin. Eric held a plastic snow shovel, his breath pluming in the freezing wind. I need to be clear about this moment. Eric did not doubt my fidelity. He never accused me of betraying him. But the constant humiliation of knowing his own family viewed him with pity broke something deep inside his chest. He dropped the shovel onto the icy pavement and rubbed his face with thick leather gloves. He confessed that his uncles were making quiet jokes behind his back at the local hardware store. He told me he felt like a fool every time he walked into a family gathering. He was crumbling under the weight of the public shame my mother had engineered. Standing there in the biting cold, I felt a profound, suffocating isolation. My mother was successfully driving a wedge into my home using nothing but whispers and casseroles. I stepped closer to my husband and took his gloved hands in mine. I told him we were going to shut the rumors down permanently. We agreed right there in the snow to pay out of pocket for a non-invasive prenatal paternity blood test. Our health insurance refused to cover the procedure without a documented medical necessity, forcing me to dip into my modest emergency savings. The out-of-pocket cost was steep, but peace of mind has no price tag. Later that same evening, my father Thomas came over to our house to help Eric fix a jammed snowblower. My father is a gentle, quiet man who avoids conflict whenever possible. He prefers the solace of his garage to the drama of his wife's social circles. He walked into our kitchen wearing his heavy wool winter coat, tracking melting snow across the linoleum floor. Pinned to the lapel of his coat was a bright brass badge from the local Veterans of Foreign Wars blood bank. It read, Type O, positive 10-gallon donor, in bold, stamped lettering. He tapped the brass pin proudly, joking that his blood type was the most reliable thing about him. He mentioned how much he loved donating at the VFW hall because it gave him a quiet place to read the newspaper away from the noise of the house. It seemed like a quirky cultural detail at the time. It was just an older man boasting about his civic duty and his reliable health. I smiled and poured him a cup of hot cider, watching him chat with Eric about small engine repairs. I had no idea that his deep pride in his specific blood type would eventually become the key to dismantling my mother's entire life. Eric and I ordered the prenatal DNA test the very next morning. We navigated the clinical logistics, drew the blood vials, and sent the samples off to an independent laboratory. We waited for the results with bated breath, knowing the paper trail would secure our marriage against the gossip. I thought the worst of the emotional turmoil was behind me. I assumed my mother was merely acting out of petty jealousy or a misplaced desire for control. But winter in the upper Midwest is unpredictable. The weather can change in a heartbeat, trapping you in circumstances you never anticipated. My mother was about to show me a vulnerable, fractured side of herself I had never seen before, leaving me to question everything I thought I knew about the woman who raised me. February arrived with a punishing force. The sky over the Twin Cities turned a bruised shade of violet before unleashing a historic winter storm. The weather alerts warned everyone to stay off the roads as a paralyzing sheet of white quickly buried the streets. I was deep into my third trimester. My body ached with the heavy, low weight of the baby. Eric was out on the lakes finishing his final rotation before his scheduled paternity leave. The house felt cavernous and empty. The wind howled against the siding, rattling the window panes and piling snowdrifts against the front door. I sat in the living room wrapped in a thick wool blanket, watching the ice form fractal patterns on the glass. I felt isolated and physically exhausted. The rumors my mother had planted still hovered in the back of my mind, casting a shadow over my normally quiet sanctuary. Around 6 in the evening, I saw a pair of headlights struggling up my unplowed driveway. The vehicle pushed through the thick snowpack, fishtailing slightly, before coming to a halt near the garage. I pushed myself up from the sofa and waddled toward the entryway, turning on the porch light. Through the frosted glass, I recognized the boxy shape of an old green Subaru. It was my mother. The drive from her house in Lexington usually took 30 minutes. In these blinding whiteout conditions, it must have taken her well over an hour of treacherous navigation. I opened the heavy front door, bracing against the biting wind. Linda stood on the porch covered in snow, holding a large insulated container wrapped in a thick dish towel. She stepped into the foyer, stomping the snow off her boots. She did not wear her usual polished expression. Her face was flushed from the cold, and her hair was flattened by her knit hat. She handed me the container. "I brought you some wild rice soup," she said, her teeth chattering slightly. "I knew Eric was away, and I did not want you trying to cook in this weather." I took the heavy container, carrying it into the kitchen. I was stunned. The woman standing in my hallway, risking her own safety to bring me a warm meal, was impossible to reconcile with the woman who had spent the last 2 months questioning my fidelity. I spooned the thick, creamy soup into 2 ceramic bowls. The rich scent of roasted chicken, wild rice, and carrots filled the kitchen, chasing away the chill. We sat at the small wooden dining table. The tension that usually defined our recent interactions was gone. The toxic paranoia evaporated, leaving behind a fragile, quiet peace. Linda took off her wet gloves and reached across the table. Her fingers were still cold from the steering wheel. She gently brushed a stray lock of hair out of my face, tucking it behind my ear. It was a tender maternal gesture I had craved for months. For the first time since my pregnancy announcement, she looked at me with genuine, unfiltered affection. We ate in silence for a few minutes, listening to the wind batter the roof. Then Linda set her spoon down and stared into her half-empty bowl. A heavy sorrow seemed to wash over her features. She looked out the dark kitchen window, at the swirling snow. "It is so hard being alone in a house this size," she murmured. "The silence can play tricks on your mind." I nodded, agreeing with her. I told her I missed Eric, but I knew he was providing for our growing family. Linda sighed, a ragged, uneven sound. She folded her hands tightly on the tabletop. "Your father used to travel often for work when your brother Lars was young," she said, her voice dropping to a low whisper. "He was trying to climb the corporate ladder. He meant well, but he left me alone for weeks at a time. It is a terrible burden. Wives carry so many burdens in the dark, Victoria. You sit in an empty room and the loneliness becomes a physical ache. You start looking for warmth anywhere you can find it. Tears welled up in her eyes, spilling over her lower lashes. She did not wipe them away. She looked at me with a raw, agonizing vulnerability. "You do not know what women have to do to keep a family from freezing to death," she continued, her voice trembling with unshed grief. "The world demands perfection from mothers. We are supposed to hold everything together. We are supposed to smile and attend the church suppers and pretend our hearts are not breaking. But survival requires difficult choices." She reached out and squeezed my hand. Her grip was tight, almost desperate. "You have to protect your home, Victoria. You have to protect your baby. Because sometimes the blood we share isn't the blood that matters. Sometimes the families we build are held together by the secrets we keep." The cryptic words hung in the warm air of the kitchen. I did not understand the profound literal truth hidden inside her warning. I assumed she was speaking metaphorically about the emotional toll of a lonely marriage. I assumed she was projecting her own historical marital struggles onto my relationship with Eric. Her tears broke my heart. Seeing my mother stripped of her arrogant armor sitting in my kitchen, weeping over a bowl of soup, filled me with overwhelming empathy. I wanted to soothe her pain. I wanted to reassure her that my marriage was strong and that she did not need to worry about me. I squeezed her hand back. I opened my mouth to tell her the truth. I wanted to confess that Eric and I had already taken the prenatal paternity test. I wanted to tell her the results were sitting in a sealed envelope, proving beyond any doubt that our family was secure. I thought the data would comfort her and erase the irrational fears haunting her mind. I took a breath, ready to share the secret. But before I could form the words, the fragile connection shattered. Linda pulled her hand away as if she had been burned. The raw vulnerability vanished from her eyes, instantly replaced by a rigid defensive glare. She straightened her posture and wiped her cheeks with the back of her wrist. The warm mother I had glimpsed for an hour retreated behind a wall of cold politeness. She stood up abruptly, pushing her chair back from the table. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the linoleum floor. "I should get back on the road before the plows stop running," she announced, her tone brisk and impersonal. I followed her into the foyer, feeling disoriented by the sudden shift in her demeanor. She pulled on her damp coat and wrapped her thick scarf around her neck, avoiding my gaze. I thanked her for the soup, but she only offered a tight nod in return. She opened the front door, letting a gust of freezing wind sweep into the house. "Drive safe," I called out as she marched through the snow toward her vehicle. She did not look back. I watched her taillights fade into the whiteout conditions, leaving me alone in the silent hallway. I locked the door and returned to the kitchen. I stared at the 2 empty ceramic bowls on the table. The evening had revealed a crucial piece of the puzzle. My mother was not acting out of simple malice or petty jealousy. Her relentless campaign to cast doubt on my pregnancy was rooted in a deep, agonizing personal trauma. She was carrying a heavy, invisible weight. At the time, I believed it was merely the psychological scar tissue of a difficult, lonely marriage to my father. I thought she was projecting her own past unhappiness onto my current situation. I cleaned the dishes, feeling a misguided sense of relief. I believed I finally understood her motives. I thought the worst of the emotional turmoil was behind us. I had no idea that her cryptic warning about the blood we share was a literal confession. I packed my hospital bag later that week, carefully tucking the sealed envelope with the DNA test between my clothes. I prepared for the birth of my son, believing the truth would set us all free. I did not realize that exposing the truth at the hospital would unleash a retaliatory strike that would threaten my child's entire future. The morning after the hospital incident felt like waking up in the center of a crater. The harsh fluorescent lights of the maternity ward hummed above us. Eric sat in the vinyl recliner holding our son. His parents returned shortly after sunrise. They did not bring balloons or cheerful stuffed animals. They brought quiet, awkward apologies. The printed prenatal test had served its purpose. Eric's mother stood at the foot of my bed, wringing her hands and whispering how sorry she was for ever doubting us. The paper trail had effectively extinguished the immediate gossip within his family. We thought the worst of the ordeal was finished. We assumed my mother would retreat in shame and offer a tearful apology of her own. We underestimated the depths of her pride. My mother did not apologize. She doubled down. When a narcissist faces public humiliation, they do not self-reflect. They rewrite the narrative to frame themselves as the victim. Word reached us through my father Thomas. He called my cell phone, sounding exhausted and confused. Linda had locked herself in their master bedroom, refusing to speak to him. She was also ignoring phone calls from my older brother, Lars. Lars is the undisputed golden child of our family. He runs a local contracting business and usually holds my mother's undivided attention. For Linda to ignore his calls meant she was barricading herself inside a fortress of her own delusion. She began calling her friends in the church congregation, spinning a new story. She claimed the sealed envelope I produced was a theatrical stunt. She told the women in her prayer circle that the prenatal test was doctored. She argued that a true DNA test required a post-birth cheek swab and that I was hiding behind fake medical documents to cover my tracks. She was willing to burn her relationship with her daughter to the ground rather than admit she was wrong in front of her peers. We were discharged from the hospital 2 days later. Eric drove us home through the slush-covered streets of St. Paul. Carrying my newborn son over the threshold of our house should have been a triumphant, joyful moment. Instead, the air inside our home felt heavy and fragile. We spent the first week navigating the sleepless haze of new parenthood, trying to block out the lingering toxicity of the hospital ambush. I focused on feeding the baby and healing. I convinced myself that my mother's delusional campaign would simply fade away once she ran out of an audience. I was wrong. 7 days after we brought our son home, the mail carrier dropped a thick, certified envelope into our mailbox. I was sitting at the kitchen table drinking decaffeinated tea, while Eric rocked the baby in the living room. I sliced the envelope open with a butter knife. The return address belonged to a probate court in Hennepin County. I pulled out a stack of dense legal paperwork and began reading. The warmth drained from my body, replacing my fatigue with a sharp, sudden dread. My late grandfather was a pragmatic, forward-thinking man. When he passed away, he left behind a specific financial vehicle designed to protect his descendants. He established a generation-skipping testamentary trust. It was a generous, well-structured fund. The stipulations of his will were explicit and legally binding. Upon the birth of any biological great-grandchild, the designated trustee was required to disburse a set sum of money directly into a college savings account for that child. It was meant to be a joyous financial head start. My mother was the named trustee of that account. The document in my hands was a formal legal objection filed by Linda. She had petitioned the probate court to freeze the mandated disbursement for my son. In the designated blank space for her reasoning, she had typed 2 chilling words: unverified paternity. She leveraged the exact phrasing of my grandfather's will. Because the trust mandated the funds go to a biological descendant, she used her fabricated doubts about Eric's fatherhood as a legal weapon to block the transfer. The paperwork stared back at me, stark and undeniable. This was no longer just a hurtful rumor whispered over church casseroles. This was a calculated financial assault. My background as an operations coordinator trains me to see the mechanics behind a process. I look at supply chains and identify the bottlenecks. I analyze data to find the hidden strategies. Reading the probate filing, I saw exactly what my mother was doing. She knew the prenatal test I showed at the hospital was medically accurate. She was not freezing the trust because she genuinely doubted the biology. She was freezing the trust to bleed us out. She knew that fighting a probate objection requires hiring a family law attorney. It requires filing motions, paying court fees, and jumping through endless bureaucratic hoops. She was using the legal system to wage a war of attrition. She wanted to drain our savings and exhaust our spirits. She wanted to punish us for humiliating her in the maternity ward. I carried the papers into the living room. Eric looked up from the baby, his face softening into a tired smile. Then he saw my expression. I handed him the probate filing. He read the objection silently. The gentle demeanor of a new father vanished. The stoic Scandinavian patience he usually carried evaporated in an instant. His jaw tightened and a dark, furious flush crept up his neck. Eric stood up and gently placed our sleeping son into the bassinet. He turned toward the front door, grabbing his heavy winter coat and his truck keys from the entry table. He did not say a word, but his intentions were loud and clear. He was going to drive to Lexington. He was going to stand on my parents' front porch and break the door off its hinges. He was going to force my mother to look him in the eye and retract her lies. I dropped the papers and ran into the narrow hallway. I stepped right in front of him, planting my feet on the hardwood floor. I pressed both of my hands flat against his chest, pushing him back. He tried to step around me, but I shifted my weight, blocking his path to the door. "You cannot go over there," I pleaded, my voice trembling. Eric glared down at me. His eyes were wide with a fierce protective rage. "She is calling my son a bastard in a court of law, Victoria. I am not going to sit in this house and let her do this to us. I am going to make her fix it." He pushed forward again. I wrapped my arms around his waist, anchoring myself to him. The dam holding back my postpartum emotions finally broke. I buried my face into his coat and started sobbing. Deep, racking cries tore through my chest. The sheer exhaustion of labor, the trauma of the hospital, and the terror of this new legal threat all collided at once. "Please, Eric," I begged, crying so hard I could barely catch my breath. "If you go over there screaming, she will call the police. She will play the victim. That is exactly what she wants. She wants to prove we are unstable. She wants to destroy us." Eric stopped fighting my grip. He stood frozen in the hallway, listening to me weep. The truck keys jingled as his hand dropped to his side. He wrapped his arms around my shaking shoulders, pulling me tight against his chest. We stood there in our own home, held hostage by a woman who refused to surrender her toxic delusion. I cried until my throat burned. I was terrified. My mother had taken a joyous milestone and turned it into a battleground. She had weaponized the legal system against her own flesh and blood. Proving my innocence at the hospital was supposed to be the end of the conflict. I realized now it was only the opening skirmish. To secure my child's future, I was going to have to step into the bureaucratic arena and fight her on her own terms. The paper trail had saved me once. I prayed it would save me again. 2 days after the probate letter arrived, I drove across the river to downtown Minneapolis. The winter air was sharp and unforgiving, slicing through my wool coat as I walked from the parking garage to a towering glass office building. I carried a leather folder containing the probate objection and the certified prenatal DNA results. I was running on 4 hours of broken sleep. My body still ached from childbirth, but the adrenaline of a legal threat pushed me forward. I rode the elevator to the 22nd floor, stepping into the hushed, carpeted lobby of a specialized family law firm. I met with a senior attorney named Marcus. He was a pragmatic man who spoke in measured, precise sentences. He did not offer emotional comfort. He offered legal strategy. We sat in his corner office overlooking the frozen expanse of the Mississippi River. I slid the manila envelope across his polished desk. I explained the situation, detailing the hospital ambush and the subsequent legal freeze my mother had placed on the generation-skipping testamentary trust. I tapped my finger confidently on the prenatal paternity test, assuming it was the silver bullet that would instantly resolve the probate dispute. Marcus picked up the document. He read the laboratory heading and the probability percentages. He set the paper down and leaned back in his leather chair. He delivered a frustrating reality check that knocked the wind out of my lungs. "This test is excellent for medical peace of mind, Victoria." He explained, his tone completely neutral, "but it is entirely useless in a probate court." I stared at him. The confusion must have been obvious on my face. I argued that the test was certified by an independent laboratory and demonstrated a 99.9% genetic match. "The science is not the issue," Marcus replied, resting his elbows on the desk. "The issue is the chain of custody. You and your husband ordered an out-of-pocket prenatal kit. You had the blood drawn at a private clinic without a court-appointed monitor present to verify your identities at the exact moment of collection. Because you initiated the test privately, your mother's attorney will successfully argue that the document is legally inadmissible for financial matters. They will claim there is no absolute proof the samples were not tampered with before reaching the lab." He leaned forward, looking directly at me. "A probate judge will not override a trustee's objection based on a private medical record. If you want to compel the court to unfreeze the disbursement and force your mother to release the funds, you must establish a flawless legal chain of custody." I asked him what that required. He outlined a bureaucratic nightmare. Eric and I had to petition the court to order a formal post-birth DNA test. We would have to take our newborn son to an approved state-monitored facility. The entire process, from filing the initial motions to receiving the certified results, would take several months. It would also cost thousands of dollars in retainer fees and court costs. My mother had successfully trapped us in an expensive, agonizing waiting game. I left the law firm feeling hollowed out. The financial strain was daunting, but the emotional toll was devastating. My mother had forced us to prove a truth we already knew using a system designed to treat us like suspects. 3 weeks later, the court order came through. Eric took a rare morning off from his logistics work on the freighters. We bundled our infant son into his car seat, protecting him from the bitter Minnesota wind, and drove to the state-approved testing facility in a drab industrial park in St. Paul. The building felt like a police precinct. The waiting room featured scuffed linoleum floors and hard plastic chairs. A thick pane of bulletproof glass separated the receptionist from the public. We filled out stacks of intake forms, handing over our driver's licenses and social security cards. A bored technician wearing blue latex gloves called our names. We were led down a narrow hallway into a sterile, windowless examination room. The procedure was rigid and dehumanizing. The technician informed us that to establish the legal chain of custody, we had to be formally identified. We were instructed to stand against a blank white wall. A digital camera snapped our photographs like mugshots. We were then required to press our thumbs onto an electronic scanner, recording our fingerprints into the state database. I watched Eric step up to the scanner. He is a proud, hard-working man who spends his life navigating massive steel ships through treacherous ice. He provides for our family without complaint. Now he was being fingerprinted in a sterile room treated with cold suspicion simply because his mother-in-law decided to weaponize her own paranoia. The technician handed Eric a long, sterile cotton swab. He instructed my husband to hold his mouth open while he scraped the inside of his cheek. Eric complied, staring straight ahead with a blank expression. The technician then turned to our son. Eric lifted the baby out of the car seat. He cradled the small, fragile body against his broad chest. The technician leaned in and inserted a smaller swab into our newborn's mouth, rubbing it against his gums. The baby squirmed and let out a sharp, unhappy cry. I stood in the corner of the room, clutching my purse. The air in the room felt thick and suffocating. Eric pulled the baby closer, hushing him softly. He pressed his lips against the top of our son's head. When Eric looked up the stoic Scandinavian facade, he warlike armor finally cracked. His eyes were bright with tears. He did not sob or make a sound. He simply stood there holding his child, weeping quiet, angry tears. The tears tracked down his cheeks, tracing the lines of exhaustion around his eyes. He was crying at the sheer profound indignity of the moment. He was a father forced by a bureaucracy to scientifically prove his connection to his own flesh and blood. My mother had dragged him into this sterile room and stripped him of his dignity. I looked at my husband, and a white-hot fury ignited in my chest. The anger I felt in the hospital delivery room was a messy hormonal reaction. This new anger was cold, dense, and permanent. My mother had not just insulted me, she had humiliated the man I loved. She had turned the joyous arrival of our first child into a sterile forensic investigation. We walked out of the facility in silence. The winter air hit my face, freezing the tears I had not realized were falling. The technician informed us the certified results would be mailed directly to our attorney in 3 weeks. We had to wait 21 days while the legal clock ticked and the probate freeze remained active. Eric secured the car seat in the back of his truck. He closed the door and leaned against the cold metal, staring out at the gray sky. I walked over and wrapped my arms around him. We stood in the parking lot, letting the cold numb the pain. I promised him right then that I would not just unfreeze the trust fund. I was going to find out exactly why my mother was so obsessed with biological purity. I was going to tear down the facade she used to terrorize our family. The legal battle was just a mechanism to get our money back. The real war was going to require a completely different strategy, and I knew exactly where to start digging. The 3-week waiting period for the court-ordered DNA results felt like a deliberate punishment. The silence stretching between my house and my parents' home in Lexington was heavy and unyielding. Eric returned to the freighters a few days after our humiliating visit to the testing facility. The massive ships had to move, and the logistics schedule did not pause for family drama. I was left alone in the house with a newborn baby and a mounting legal bill. The anger I felt in the parking lot did not dissipate. It crystallized into a sharp, focused drive. I needed to understand why my mother was willing to burn her relationship with me to the ground. I sat at my kitchen table late one night staring at the dense legal paperwork from the probate court. People rarely detonate their own families without a profound hidden motive. I analyzed the situation, trying to find the logical thread. My mind immediately gravitated toward the most obvious suspect. I looked at the name of the designated trustee printed on the documents and then thought about my older brother, Lars. Lars is the undisputed golden child of the family. While my mother constantly scrutinized my choices, she viewed Lars through a lens of unconditional leniency. 6 months ago, Lars decided to quit his stable job at a logistics firm to start his own independent contracting business. The venture was a disaster from the beginning. He lacked the operational discipline to manage the supply chains, and his overhead costs quickly outpaced his revenue. He was bleeding cash. During Sunday dinners, I had watched him quietly pull our mother aside, whispering furiously in the kitchen while avoiding my father's gaze. A theory began to solidify in my mind. The generation-skipping testamentary trust contained a substantial amount of money. My grandfather had designed it carefully to ensure the funds bypassed his daughter, entirely going straight to his great-grandchildren. My mother had no legal right to touch the principal for her own use. However, as the trustee, she controlled the administrative flow of the accounts. I convinced myself the entire paternity ambush was a smokescreen. I believed Linda was freezing the mandatory disbursement for my son because the money simply was not there. I assumed she had secretly embezzled the trust funds to bail out Lars and his failing contracting business. When my pregnancy triggered the legal requirement to disburse a set sum, she panicked. She needed a reason to delay the payout, so she invented the adultery rumor, claiming unverified paternity to block the probate court from auditing the empty accounts. The theory made perfect logical sense. It aligned with her historical favoritism toward Lars and explained her desperate, irrational behavior at the hospital. I needed proof. I could not wait for the slow, grinding wheels of the probate court to uncover a financial discrepancy months down the line. I needed leverage now. My professional career as an operations coordinator is built entirely on finding anomalies in complex systems. I track missing inventory across international borders. I uncover supply chain discrepancies hidden in thousands of lines of data. I know how to find the broken link in a chain. If my mother wanted to play games with medical and financial records, I was going to use data to fight back. I realized I could not just demand access to her bank statements or the trust ledgers without a subpoena. I needed a sideways approach. I needed access to a different data set that could expose a crack in her carefully constructed facade. The opportunity presented itself 2 days later during a phone call with the head of the Community Outreach Committee at our Lutheran church. Every late winter, our congregation co-hosts a massive community blood drive in partnership with the local Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall. It is a highly anticipated civic event, drawing hundreds of participants from the surrounding suburbs. It is a point of deep communal pride. My family participates religiously. My father Thomas treats the blood drive like a holy obligation, always arriving early to chat with the other veterans and donate his standard pint. Lars usually tags along, using the event to network for his contracting business while eating the complimentary donuts. The committee chair mentioned they were desperately short-handed on administrative volunteers. The previous logistics manager had moved to Duluth, leaving a massive gap in their organizational structure. The event required coordinating hundreds of intake forms, managing the digital donor registry, and ensuring the medical history questionnaires were processed correctly before the phlebotomists began their work. I offered to take this position. I framed it as a desire to give back to the community while on maternity leave. The committee chair accepted my offer with immense relief. She granted me full administrative access to the digital intake portal and handed over the logistical reins for the entire event. I did not volunteer out of a sense of civic duty. I volunteered because taking control of the logistics placed me directly at the center of the data stream. Managing the intake portal gave me legitimate authorized access to the medical history forms for every member of the congregation who registered to donate. That included my father and my brother. I spent the next 2 weeks organizing the event from my home office, while the baby slept in the bassinet beside my desk. I streamlined the digital registration process, setting up automated reminders and creating efficient physical intake stations for the gymnasium. I built a flawless operational system. But my true focus remained on the back-end database. I monitored the incoming registrations, watching the names populate the digital ledger. As expected, my father Thomas registered early in the week. Lars registered a few days later, followed by dozens of other familiar names from the neighborhood. I was not entirely sure what I was looking for. I thought perhaps I could find a discrepancy in Lars's emergency contact information or an updated address that might hint at a foreclosure or a hidden financial strain. I was hunting for a thread I could pull to unravel the financial embezzlement theory I had constructed. The morning of the blood drive dawned clear and bitterly cold. I arrived at the church gymnasium 2 hours before the doors opened. The space smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. I set up the registration tables, arranging the laptops and organizing the privacy screens for the medical questionnaires. The Red Cross technicians arrived shortly after setting up the donation beds and unpacking the sterile equipment. By 9 o'clock, the gymnasium was bustling with activity. I sat at the primary intake desk processing the donors as they arrived. I verified their identities, scanned their registration codes, and directed them to the medical screening booths. I operated with a brisk professional efficiency, keeping the lines moving smoothly. I saw my father walk through the double doors around 10 in the morning. He wore his heavy wool winter coat, his familiar brass 10-gallon donor pin gleaming on his lapel. He offered me a hesitant, sad smile as he approached my table. The tension from the hospital ambush still hovered between us, but the public setting enforced a polite distance. I processed his intake form, confirming his details in the system. He moved on to the screening area, taking a seat in the waiting chairs. An hour later, Lars walked into the gymnasium. He looked exhausted. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his posture lacked its usual arrogant confidence. The stress of his failing business was clearly taking a physical toll. He approached my desk, handing me his driver's license without saying a word. We had not spoken since my mother locked herself in her bedroom. I typed his name into the database, pulling up his digital medical questionnaire. I was prepared to quietly scrutinize his personal details, searching for any hint of financial distress. I scrolled through the standard questions, verifying his eligibility to donate. I reached the section detailing his basic medical profile, expecting to find nothing of consequence. Instead, my eyes locked onto a single line of data near the bottom of the screen. I stopped breathing. The ambient noise of the gymnasium, the chatter of the donors, and the hum of the portable heaters faded into a dull roar. The red herring theory I had carefully constructed over the past 3 weeks shattered instantly. My mother had not embezzled the trust fund. The secret she was hiding was not financial. It was biological, and the proof was staring back at me from a brightly lit computer monitor. The gymnasium floor was a sea of scuffed hardwood marked with faded basketball lines. Red Cross banners hung from the bleachers. The air was thick with the scent of rubbing alcohol and the quiet murmur of waiting donors. I sat behind the primary registration laptop, staring at the digital intake form illuminating the screen. Lars stood on the opposite side of the folding table, shifting his weight impatiently. He looked past me, scanning the room for familiar faces, checking his watch with a nervous energy. He was oblivious to the catastrophic data point resting just below my cursor. I looked at the line detailing his documented medical history. It read, blood type AB negative. I stared at those 2 letters and the negative sign. A cold, heavy sensation pooled in the pit of my stomach. My mind raced, trying to process the information through the clinical lens of operations management. An operations coordinator looks for data that does not align with the established system. When a supply chain breaks, you trace the materials backward until you find the exact point of contamination. The data sitting on my screen was a profound biological contamination. I glanced across the gymnasium. My father Thomas was sitting in a recovery chair sipping a juice box. He was proudly wearing his heavy wool coat. Pinned to his lapel, glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights, was the brass badge he cherished. Type O, positive 10-gallon donor. My mother's blood type is a positive. I know this because she required a minor transfusion during a routine surgery 5 years ago, and I handled the insurance paperwork. I minimized the intake portal on my laptop and quickly opened a new browser tab. My hands were shaking slightly. I typed a search query for a standard Mendelian genetic inheritance chart. A grid appeared on my screen displaying the possible combinations of parental blood types. The science is rigid and unforgiving. It does not care about family loyalty or carefully curated reputations. A parent with type O blood has two O alleles. A parent with type A blood can have either two A alleles or one A and one O allele. When these two parents conceive a child, they can only pass down what they possess. Therefore, a type O parent and a type A parent can only physically produce a child with type O or type A blood. It is genetically impossible for them to produce a child with type AB blood. The B allele has to come from somewhere. It has to come from the biological father. Lars has AB negative blood. Thomas has O positive blood. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The air in my lungs rushed out, leaving me breathless. I gripped the edge of the folding table, my knuckles turning white. The screen blurred for a fraction of a second as the massive implications of this biological discrepancy slammed into my consciousness. The red herring theory regarding the embezzled trust funds instantly disintegrated. The financial struggle Lars was experiencing with his contracting business was irrelevant. My mother was not freezing the generation-skipping testamentary trust to hide stolen money. She was freezing the trust to hide a 30-year-old lie. The plot twist completely reversed the entire landscape of our family conflict. I had spent months trying to understand why my mother was so obsessed with the timeline of my pregnancy. I agonized over why she would weaponize the long weeks my husband spent working on the Lake Superior freighters. She had planted rumors in the church community. She had ambushed me in the delivery room, claiming my son was illegitimate. It was not a random delusion. It was not petty jealousy. It was textbook psychological projection. My mother looked at my marriage and saw a mirror reflecting her own hidden sins. When Eric went away for 4-week rotations on the iron ore ships, leaving me alone in a quiet house, Linda did not see a loyal wife waiting for her husband. She saw the exact same isolation she had experienced 30 years ago when Thomas was traveling constantly to climb the corporate ladder. She looked at my circumstances and superimposed her own guilt onto my life. 30 years ago, my mother had an affair. The timeline aligned perfectly. Thomas was away on long-haul assignments. Linda was alone in a large, empty house, suffocating under the expectations of suburban perfection. She had warned me during the blizzard that wives carry terrible burdens in the dark. She had warned me that sometimes the blood we share is not the blood that matters. I thought she was offering a cryptic metaphor about emotional survival. I did not realize she was making a literal confession. Lars, the undisputed golden child. The son she held up on a pedestal, demanding perfection, while simultaneously granting him endless leniency. The boy she shielded from criticism and protected at all costs. Lars was not Thomas's biological son. He was the product of a secret affair. He was the actual illegitimate child in our family. My mother attacked my legitimate baby in a desperate subconscious attempt to distract from her own bastard son. She projected her own infidelity onto me, using the aggressive accusation to build a fortress around her own shame. If she could convince the community that I was the unfaithful wife, it diverted any potential scrutiny away from her own history. The devastating cruelty she inflicted on me in the hospital was an act of pure panicked self-preservation. I sat behind the registration table, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the secret sitting on my hard drive. Lars tapped his fingers on the table, snapping me back to the present moment. "Is there a problem with the registration, Victoria?" he asked, his voice edged with irritation. "I have to get back to a job site." I forced myself to breathe. The operational discipline kicked in, overriding the shock. I could not let him see the panic in my eyes. I could not alert my mother that the foundation of her entire life had just cracked open on a church computer. "No problem, Lars," I replied, forcing my voice to remain steady and professional. "The system just lagged for a second. You are cleared for screening. Go ahead to booth number 3. He nodded curtly, taking his identification card from my hand and walking toward the partitioned screening area. I watched him walk away. My older brother, the man who had mocked me at family dinners, the man who had enjoyed the unwavering adoration of a mother who constantly found fault with me. He was walking across a gymnasium floor, completely unaware that his entire identity was a fabrication. He did not know that the man he called his father shared zero genetic material with him. He did not know that his mother had built a 30-year facade of Minnesota niece politeness on top of a profound, devastating betrayal. I looked back at the screen. The AB negative blood type glowed in the sterile light of the spreadsheet. I had successfully uncovered the supply chain discrepancy. I had found the broken link. I possessed the exact data point required to tear my mother's life down to the studs. I held the absolute power to destroy her reputation within the church community she prized above all else. I could vindicate myself permanently. But as the initial shock subsided, a terrifying secondary realization began to settle over me. The data was a weapon of mass destruction. If I detonated this secret to unfreeze my son's trust fund, the collateral damage would be catastrophic. The blast radius would not just consume my mother, it would annihilate my father. I looked across the room at Thomas. He was smiling, chatting with an older veteran holding a paper cup of orange juice. He was a gentle, proud man who had spent his life working quietly to provide for a family he believed was his own. Exposing the truth about Lars would break his heart in a way he would never recover from. It would strip him of his son and destroy his marriage in the twilight of his life. I sat behind the laptop, the weight of the secret pressing down on my chest like a physical stone. I was the operations coordinator. I was supposed to fix the broken systems. But this was not a missing shipment of industrial parts. This was a family. I had to decide if clearing my own name and securing my child's financial future was worth the total annihilation of the man who raised me. The battle was no longer just about proving my innocence. It was about deciding who was going to survive the fallout. The drive home from the church gymnasium felt like navigating through a thick fog. I gripped the steering wheel with numb fingers. The heater blasted warm air into the cabin, but a deep, persistent chill radiated from my own bones. Discovering the ultimate leverage should have felt like a victory. I had successfully tracked the supply chain discrepancy to its source. I possessed the raw data needed to break my mother's legal blockade and secure my son's financial future. I held the winning hand. Yet I did not feel triumphant. I felt physically sick. A sour knot of nausea twisted in my stomach, forcing me to pull over on the shoulder of the road for several minutes just to breathe. I rested my forehead against the cold steering wheel. The thrill of solving the puzzle was instantly eclipsed by the horrifying reality of what the solution meant. I thought back to the night of the blizzard. I remembered my mother sitting at my kitchen table, wrapped in her damp coat, weeping over a bowl of wild rice soup. She had brushed the hair from my face and warned me about the terrible burdens wives carry in the dark. She told me that sometimes the blood we share is not the blood that matters. At the time, I viewed her words as a dramatic metaphor for the isolation of a lonely marriage. Now the cryptic warning revealed its true shape. It was a literal confession bleeding out through the cracks of her polished facade. For 3 decades, Linda carried the suffocating weight of an unforgivable secret. She spent 30 years terrified that her mistake would be discovered. Every time Lars went to the doctor or participated in a school blood drive, she must have held her breath praying no one would notice the glaring genetic mismatch. When my husband Eric began working long rotations on the Lake Superior freighters, leaving me alone in our house, it mirrored the exact circumstances of her own infidelity. The parallel terrified her. Instead of offering me support, she projected her deepest shame onto my marriage. She attacked my legitimate pregnancy to build a defensive perimeter around her own hidden sin. I pulled my car into my driveway and walked into my quiet house. Eric was still out on the water. The baby was asleep in the nursery. I did not turn on the lights. I dropped my keys on the counter and began to pace the length of the living room hardwood floor. The silence of the house amplified the chaotic storm raging in my mind. I was trapped in a terrible, messy internal conflict. The legal path forward was clear and straightforward. To compel the probate court to unfreeze the generation-skipping testamentary trust, I needed to prove that my mother was acting in bad faith. If I presented the judge with the blood type discrepancy, demonstrating that Linda was projecting her own infidelity onto me, the court would immediately recognize her as an unfit trustee. The judge would strip her of her power and release the funds to my son. The financial hostage situation would end. But the collateral damage of that legal maneuver would be apocalyptic. Submitting that evidence to the probate court meant entering the biological reality into the public record. The truth would not stay confined to a judge's chambers. It would detonate inside my family. My thoughts drifted to my father. Thomas is a gentle, steady man. He never cared about country club memberships or social posturing. His entire world revolves around his children. I pictured him teaching Lars how to skate on the frozen ponds of our neighborhood. I remembered the two of them spending countless weekends ice fishing on Mille Lacs, sharing thermoses of hot coffee and talking about hockey tournaments. Thomas built his entire identity around being a father to that boy. If I handed the genetic data to the lawyers, I would obliterate my father's reality. I would force a kind, loyal man to spend his twilight years wrestling with the agonizing knowledge that his wife betrayed him and his namesake son belonged to a stranger. It would break his heart in a way that no amount of time or therapy could ever repair. The blast radius would also consume my brother. Lars and I rarely see eye to eye. He is arrogant and currently failing at his contracting business. But he does not deserve to have his foundational identity ripped away. Uncovering the truth would force Lars to realize the man he spent his life trying to impress shares zero genetic material with him. It would orphan him emotionally. I walked into the nursery and stood over the crib. The soft, yellow nightlight cast long shadows across the painted walls. My son breathed in a quiet, rhythmic pattern. His small hands were curled into loose fists near his face. I reached down and gently rested my palm against his warm back. My mother was holding this innocent child's future hostage. She had weaponized the legal system to freeze his college fund, all to protect her fragile ego after I humiliated her in the delivery room. She was willing to steal from her own grandson to punish me. I felt a fierce primal instinct to protect my baby at any cost. If I stayed silent to protect my father and my brother, I was allowing my mother to win. I would be forced to drain our own savings, paying exorbitant legal fees to fight her probate objection. I would be letting a toxic manipulator dictate the terms of our lives. But if I fired the weapon I had uncovered, I would be the architect of my father's destruction. I spent the entire night pacing between the nursery and the living room, crying hot, frustrated tears in the dark. There was no clean, sanitized solution. Being the cycle breaker in a dysfunctional family means making choices where every available option carries a heavy, brutal cost. What would you do in this situation? Would you expose a 30-year-old family secret to the legal system to save your own child's financial future, even if it meant destroying the heart of a good man who never did anything wrong? Let me know in the comments, because navigating this choice felt like walking barefoot over broken glass. I watched the sun rise over the snow-covered rooftops of St. Paul. The gray morning light filtered through the blinds, painting the living room in muted tones. The exhaustion settled deep into my muscles, but my mind remained hyper-alert. I realized I could not rely on the probate court to handle this delicate, explosive truth. A judge would view the data as a simple legal lever. I needed to wield the information like a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. I needed a strategy that would force my mother to surrender the trust fund without making the biological secret a matter of public record. I had to confront her directly. I had to trap her in a corner where the only way out was to yield to my demands. To execute this plan, I still needed the final piece of our own defense. I could not confront her with her own lies until I possessed the undeniable certified proof of my own truth. We were still waiting for the chain of custody swab results to arrive from the state-approved facility. The legal clock was ticking, and my mother still believed she held the upper hand. She thought I was scrambling to find a lawyer capable of fighting her objection. She had no idea I was sitting in my living room holding the key to her absolute ruin. I just had to wait for the mail carrier to deliver the final piece of ammunition. 3 weeks passed with the agonizing pace of a thawing glacier. The Minnesota winter held its tight grip on the city, keeping everyone indoors and isolated. Eric remained out on the icy waters of Lake Superior, working his long logistics shifts. I stayed inside our quiet home, tending to our newborn son, and waiting for the postal carrier every single afternoon. The routine became a rigid daily exercise in patience. I watched the front window tracking the delivery truck as it navigated the slush-covered streets of our neighborhood. On a Tuesday afternoon, the truck finally paused at the edge of my driveway. The carrier dropped a rigid cardboard envelope into the metal box. I bundled my son in a thick fleece blanket and walked down the driveway. The frigid air bit at my cheeks. I pulled the envelope from the box. The return address belonged to the state-approved testing facility in St. Paul. The thick paper felt heavy in my hands. It was the physical manifestation of my husband's dignity and my own vindicated truth. I returned to the warmth of the kitchen. I laid the sleeping baby in his bassinet near the radiator. I sat at the wooden dining table and used a kitchen knife to slice open the rigid cardboard. Inside was a thick stack of certified documents. The top page featured a prominent gold seal pressed into the paper, catching the light from the overhead fixture. I scanned the dense legal and medical terminology until I found the final conclusive paragraph. The text was stark and definitive. It stated a 99.99% probability of paternity. It confirmed with undeniable legal certainty that Eric was the biological father of our son. A profound wave of relief washed over my tired shoulders. The humiliating ordeal of standing in that sterile facility, being photographed and fingerprinted like a criminal, had finally yielded the necessary result. I possessed the exact legal ammunition required to break the probate blockade. I could call Marcus, my family law attorney, right now. He would file an immediate injunction, submitting the gold-sealed document into evidence. The probate judge would review the certified results, dismiss my mother's objection regarding unverified paternity, and unfreeze the generation-skipping testamentary trust. My son's college fund would be secure. On paper, the war was won. The bureaucratic hurdle was cleared. I traced the raised edges of the gold seal with my index finger ready to dial the law firm. Yet a lingering sense of dread stopped me from picking up the phone. My operations background trained me to look beyond the immediate fix and evaluate the long-term sustainability of a solution. I sat back in my chair and analyzed the broader social ecosystem of my family. If I simply handed this document to a judge, I would win the financial dispute, but a court order would not change my mother. Linda operates in a realm where public perception matters more than legal truth. If a judge forced her to release the funds, she would not offer a tearful apology. She would not suddenly reflect on the trauma she caused. She would pivot. I pictured her sitting in the fellowship hall of our Lutheran church, surrounded by the same women who brought me tater-tot hottish. I could hear the exact tone of voice she would use to spin the narrative. She would paint herself as the persecuted grandmother. She would tell her prayer circle that the legal system was flawed and that I had manipulated a loophole to take control of the family money. She would lean into her role as the weary matriarch carrying the burden of an ungrateful daughter. The church community would offer her sympathy. The whispers would persist, evolving from rumors of infidelity into rumors of elder abuse. Winning in probate court was merely treating a symptom. The frozen trust fund was just a byproduct of a much deeper rot. The actual disease was my mother's unchecked social power and her desperate need to project her own hidden shame onto my life. If I did not cure the underlying disease, the toxic behavior would simply manifest in new destructive ways. She would find another avenue to undermine my marriage or alienate me from extended relatives. She needed to be stopped at the root. I realized that presenting the paternity test in a courtroom allowed her to remain comfortable in her pristine suburban life. It allowed her to keep her secrets buried. To truly disarm her, I had to remove her ability to control the narrative. I had to strip away the social armor she wore so proudly. I opened the encrypted folder on my laptop. I pulled up the photograph I took of the genetic inheritance chart. Next to it, I opened the digital screenshot of Lars's intake form from the community blood drive. The bold letters stating his blood type as AB negative stared back at me. I printed both documents on my home printer. I laid the 2 fresh sheets of paper on the kitchen table, right next to the gold-sealed paternity test. The contrast between the documents was striking. One stack of paper proved my innocence. The other stack proved her guilt. Together, they formed a strategic trap that no amount of Minnesota nice politeness could overcome. The strategy required a delicate, precise execution. I could not submit the blood type discrepancy to a judge because entering it into the public record would inevitably destroy my father. I had to use the biological truth as private leverage. I had to create a situation where my mother chose to dismantle her own power to protect her 30-year-old lie. I formulated the parameters of the confrontation. I would not engage her in her own home where she felt powerful and secure. I would not allow her to hide behind the familiar walls of the Lexington house. I needed a neutral, public environment, a place where she could not scream or cause a dramatic scene without exposing herself to the judgment of strangers. I picked up my cell phone and opened my text messages. I typed a brief direct message to Linda. I did not offer pleasantries or inquire about her day. I requested a meeting at a specific 24-hour diner located in a neighboring suburb. It was a busy, unassuming restaurant known for its endless coffee and booth seating. It was far away from the polished country clubs and church halls she frequented. I stated that we needed to discuss the future of the probate objection. I knew the mention of the trust fund would bait the hook. She would assume I was cracking under the financial pressure. She would arrive at the diner expecting me to beg for a compromise or offer a tearful surrender. She would wear her Sunday best and prepare to deliver a condescending lecture on morality. I hit send and watched the message turn blue, indicating it was delivered. The digital read receipt appeared a moment later. She had seen it. I gathered the printed documents from the kitchen table and placed them carefully into a plain manila folder. I slid the gold-sealed paternity test in first, followed by the genetic charts proving my brother's true lineage. I closed the folder and rested my hand on the smooth paper. The anxiety that had plagued me for the past month began to recede, replaced by a cold, rigid determination. The weeks of waiting and playing defense were over. I had organized the data. I had established the supply chain of events. I was ready to take control of the narrative. My mother thought she was walking into a negotiation with a desperate daughter. She had no idea she was stepping into a meticulously designed operational trap. All I had to do now was wait for her to sit down at the table. The diner in Bloomington was loud and brightly lit. It sat just off the interstate, a popular way station for truck drivers and exhausted night shift workers. The air smelled heavily of burnt coffee and frying bacon. A steady clatter of heavy ceramic plates and silverware provided a chaotic, rhythmic background noise. It was the exact opposite of the refined, quiet spaces my mother preferred. I chose this location specifically to keep her off balance. I arrived 20 minutes early and selected a booth in the corner farthest from the large plate glass windows. I ordered a glass of water and placed the manila folder flat on the sticky formica table. At exactly 2 o'clock, the heavy glass door swung open. Linda stepped inside, bringing a rush of cold winter air with her. She paused near the hostess stand, surveying the busy room with visible distaste. She wore a tailored charcoal gray wool coat and a silk scarf tied neatly at her neck. Her hair was perfectly styled, defying the harsh Minnesota wind. She looked like a woman arriving to inspect a failing charity project. She spotted me in the corner booth and walked over. Her posture was rigid, her chin tilted upward, projecting an aura of defensive pride. She slid into the vinyl seat across from me without taking off her coat. A tired waitress approached, holding a stained coffee pot. Linda ordered a black coffee, her tone clipped and dismissive. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not inquire about her newborn grandson. She folded her gloved hands on the table and looked at me with an expression of weary impatience. "I assume you have finally consulted an attorney regarding the probate matter," Linda said, initiating the conversation before her coffee even arrived. Her voice was steady, laced with the condescending sing-song rhythm of Minnesota nice. "I told you at the hospital, Victoria, that secrets always ruin the harvest. It is a tragedy you chose to hide the truth about your marriage, but I have a fiduciary duty to protect your grandfather's legacy. If you are ready to admit the reality of the situation, we can discuss a private arrangement for the child's care." She expected me to crumble. She anticipated tears pleading, or perhaps a desperate threat of a messy, protracted lawsuit. She sat there bathed in the fluorescent diner lights, fully believing she held absolute control over my family's financial future. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice to compete with the clattering dishes or the loud conversation from the neighboring booth. I kept my hands resting flat on the table to conceal the slight tremor in my fingers. My heart hammered against my ribs, a fast, erratic rhythm fueled by pure adrenaline. The confrontation I had planned for weeks was finally happening. "I am not here to discuss a private arrangement, Mom." I replied, my voice quiet but firm. "I am here to close the probate objection." I reached out and opened the plain manila folder. I pulled out the top document. The thick paper felt substantial in my hands. The gold seal of the state-approved testing facility gleamed under the harsh overhead lights. I slid the certified document across the sticky formica table, stopping it directly in front of her folded hands. "This is the court-ordered post-birth DNA analysis," I explained. "It establishes a flawless legal chain of custody. It confirms with absolute genetic certainty that Eric is the biological father. My attorney will file this with the probate judge on Monday morning, forcing the immediate release of the generation-skipping testamentary trust. Linda did not flinch. She glanced down at the gold seal and let out a short, dismissive scoff. She picked up her coffee cup and took a slow, deliberate sip, maintaining her arrogant facade. "More manufactured paperwork," she sighed, shaking her head as if dealing with a stubborn child. "You can pay private clinics to print whatever results you want, Victoria. I have seen the lengths people will go to protect a lie. A judge will still require a full hearing to verify the authenticity of this document. It will take months, and the church community already knows the truth about your timeline. A piece of paper will not change the reality of what happened while Eric was away." She was attempting to gaslight me in real time. She was doubling down on her delusion, refusing to acknowledge certified forensic data because it contradicted the narrative she needed to survive. She was preparing to retreat into her familiar victimhood, relying on her social standing within the congregation to insulate her from the facts. I took a deep, ragged breath. The tremor in my hands stopped. The nervous energy morphed into a cold, heavy certainty. I looked at the woman sitting across from me. I looked at the tailored coat and the perfect hair. I saw the arrogant matriarch who had spent my entire life scrutinizing my flaws while shielding her own massive deception. The time for presenting symptoms was over. It was time to cure the disease. "You are right," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "A piece of paper will not change the reality of what happened when a husband is away." Linda raised an eyebrow, sensing the subtle shift in my tone. The condescending smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She placed her coffee cup back onto the saucer. I reached into the manila folder a second time. I bypassed the remaining legal forms and pulled out the 2 printed sheets of paper I had prepared the night before. I held them together, aligning the edges. I slid the papers across the table. They came to rest right on top of the gold-sealed paternity test. The top sheet was a clear, high-resolution photocopy of a medical intake form. The logo for the community blood drive was printed clearly at the top. The form was filled out in thick black ink. It detailed emergency contacts, recent travel history, and basic biometric data. Near the bottom of the page, highlighted by the stark white background, was a single line of text: blood type AB negative. Just below the intake form, visible at the bottom of the stack, was the printed Mendelian genetic inheritance chart. It displayed the rigid biological rules of blood type combinations in bold, simple diagrams. Linda looked down at the table. She stared at the intake form. She read the name printed at the top of the page. Lars. She read the blood type. Her eyes flicked down to the genetic chart, tracing the lines connecting parental blood types to potential offspring. The ambient noise of the diner seemed to evaporate. The clattering plates, the shouting cooks, the hiss of the coffee machines, all faded into a vacuum of total, suffocating silence. I watched her process the data. I watched the cognitive gears turn in her mind as she applied the biological rules to her own life. A parent with type O blood and a parent with type A blood cannot produce a child with type AB negative blood. The science is absolute. It is unforgiving. It does not care about tailored coats or church bake sales. The transformation was horrific and instantaneous. The arrogant, defensive pride holding her posture together snapped like a dry twig. Her shoulders collapsed inward. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her skin an ashen, sickly gray. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. She stared at the paper as if it were a live grenade placed on the table. She realized I had not just uncovered a medical anomaly. She realized I had uncovered the source of her entire psychotic break. I had found the 30-year-old secret she had buried under layers of suburban perfection. The affair she had engaged in while Thomas was traveling. The illegitimate child she had raised as the golden son. Her eyes darted from the paper to my face. The look she gave me was one of pure, unfiltered terror. The matriarch was gone. The woman sitting across from me was a terrified, exposed fraud, realizing her entire empire was built on a biological impossibility. The leverage had shifted entirely. I possessed the exact data required to obliterate her marriage, her reputation, and her identity. I did not need a probate judge anymore. I held the keys to her absolute ruin, and she knew it. Linda stared at the photocopied intake form. The rigid posture that defined her entire public persona dissolved. Her shoulders slumped forward, and her chest began to heave in rapid, shallow increments. The silk scarf around her neck seemed to tighten, restricting her airflow. She was hyperventilating. The arrogant matriarch, who had weaponized whispers and church casseroles to destroy my marriage, was gone. The woman sitting across from me was terrified, stripped of her armor, and dragged directly into the harsh fluorescent light of a 24-hour diner. She reached out with the trembling hand, her fingers hovering inches above the paper. She did not touch it. She knew the ink was real. She knew the genetic chart was accurate. 30 years of meticulous deception had just collapsed onto a sticky Formica table. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. Her voice was thin, barely audible over the ambient noise of the restaurant. "I manage the data intake for the community blood drive," I replied, keeping my tone flat and clinical. Dad proudly registered with his O-positive donor pin. Lars registered 10 minutes later. The operational discrepancy was glaring. Linda closed her eyes. A single tear escaped, leaking into the fine lines around her mouth. She pressed her palms flat against the table, attempting to steady her shaking hands. She looked like a trapped animal, calculating the distance to the nearest exit. But there was no exit. The data locked her in place. I leaned across the table, bridging the physical distance between us. I did not yell. I did not need to raise my voice to deliver the final blow. The leverage I possessed was a weapon of mass destruction, and we both understood the catastrophic scale of the blast radius. "I know why you attacked me in the delivery room, Mom," I said, holding her panicked gaze. "You looked at my marriage and saw a mirror reflecting your own hidden history. When Eric went out on the freighters, leaving me alone, you panicked. You superimposed your own guilt onto my life. You attacked my legitimate child to build a defensive wall around your own illegitimate son. You tried to ruin my family to distract from the rot in your own." "Please! Victoria!" Linda gasped. Her eyes darted wildly around the diner, checking to see if anyone in the neighboring booths was listening. "Please keep your voice down. If your father hears about this, if Lars finds out." She could not even finish the sentence. The sheer terror of Thomas discovering the truth paralyzed her vocal cords. Thomas is a gentle, fiercely loyal man who built his entire identity around being a father to Lars. Discovering that his wife betrayed him and his namesake son belonged to a stranger would obliterate him. It would orphan Lars emotionally. I let the silence hang over the table, allowing her to fully absorb the magnitude of her exposure. I watched her calculate the impending ruin of her marriage, her social standing, and her relationship with her golden child. "I am not going to tell Dad," I stated firmly. Linda stopped gasping. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a fragile, desperate hope. "I refuse to break a good man's heart just to settle a score with you." I continued, my voice hardening. "I will not destroy Dad's twilight years, and I will not shatter my brother's identity. The secret stays buried. I will carry it." A profound, shuddering wave of relief washed over her face. She let out a long, trembling exhale, slumping back against the vinyl booth. She thought she had survived the execution. She assumed my loyalty to my father meant she had escaped the consequences of her actions. "But my silence is not a gift," I added, leaning closer. "It is a transaction, and the price is absolute." The relief vanished instantly, replaced by a new cold dread. Linda sat perfectly still, waiting for the terms of her surrender. First, I outlined, ticking the conditions off on my fingers. "You will immediately contact your attorney. You will withdraw the probate objection tomorrow morning. You will formally unfreeze the generation-skipping testamentary trust." Linda nodded rapidly, eager to comply with the financial demands. "I will call him right after we leave," she promised, her voice shaking. "I will release the funds, Victoria. I swear it." I held up my hand, stopping her frantic agreement. "Withdrawing the objection is only the first step. You are fundamentally unfit to manage my grandfather's legacy. You will formally step down as the trustee. You will sign the necessary legal documents, transferring the complete administration of the fund to an independent financial fiduciary located in Minneapolis. You will permanently relinquish all access and control over my son's college account." She swallowed hard but nodded again. The financial surrender was painful, but it was a minor concession compared to the preservation of her 30-year-old secret. She was willing to abandon the trust fund if it meant keeping her marriage intact. I reached into the manila folder one last time. I pulled out a blank legal pad and a black ink pen. I set them on the table right next to the genetic charts. I was an operations coordinator. I do not finalize a negotiation without securing the paperwork. The financial transfer secures my son's future, I said, locking my eyes onto hers. But it does not repair the damage you inflicted on my husband. You humiliated Eric in front of his parents. You poisoned the church congregation against my marriage. You tried to isolate me using rumors and casseroles. Releasing the money does not cure the disease you planted in our community. Linda stared at the blank legal pad. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice dropping to a frightened whisper. "You are going to write a letter," I instructed, tapping the pen against the paper. "You are going to write a formal signed retraction. You will address it to the elders of our Lutheran church, and you will send a certified copy directly to Eric's parents." Linda's eyes widened. She stared at me in pure, unadulterated horror. In this letter, I continued my tone devoid of any sympathy. "You will explicitly state that your accusations regarding my fidelity and my son's paternity were entirely fabricated. You will confess that your behavior at the hospital was the result of your own severe mental health struggles and deep-seated paranoia. You will state that you experienced a psychological breakdown and projected your delusions onto my family." "No!" Linda gasped, recoiling from the table as if the legal pad had caught fire. "Victoria, please. You cannot ask me to do that. If I send that letter to the church elders, they will pity me. They will remove me from the charity committees. Eric's parents will never look at me again. It will destroy my reputation in the community." I looked at her with a cold, detached certainty. "That is the point, Mom. You weaponized your social standing to attack my family. Now you are going to dismantle that standing with your own hand. You are going to voluntarily destroy your reputation to protect your secret." The ultimatum hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I was presenting her with a binary choice. She could write the letter, admit to severe paranoia, and face the humiliating pity of the congregation she prized above all else. She would become the unstable, isolated matriarch whispered about during Sunday services. Or she could refuse. She could walk out of the diner, keep her pride intact, and force me to submit the blood type discrepancy to the probate court. The genetic reality would become public record. Thomas would learn the truth about Lars. Her marriage would violently collapse, and her golden child would despise her. She had to choose between social humiliation or total family annihilation. Linda looked at the blank paper. She looked at the blood drive intake form. She realized there was no exit strategy. The trap was perfectly constructed, yielding no room for negotiation or Minnesota niece manipulation. The data held her captive. She picked up the black ink pen. Her hand shook violently, the plastic casing rattling against her gold rings. She pressed the tip of the pen to the top of the legal pad. The ink bled slightly into the paper as she hesitated, fighting the overwhelming urge to preserve her ego. "Write," I commanded softly. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks, dripping off her chin and landing on the collar of her tailored coat. She did not wipe them away. She began to write. The letters were jagged and uneven, a stark contrast to her usually elegant cursive script. She addressed the letter to the church elders. She wrote the words, "mental health struggles and severe paranoia." She documented her own surrender. I sat in the booth watching the arrogant matriarch systematically dismantle her own empire. The diner continued its chaotic rhythm around us, completely unaware of the devastating transaction occurring in the corner booth. The clattering plates and the smell of burnt coffee provided the soundtrack to her absolute ruin. She finished the letter and signed her name at the bottom. She slid the legal pad across the table toward me. She did not look up. She kept her eyes fixed on her cold black coffee, shattered by the weight of her own hypocrisy. I picked up the legal pad, verifying the contents of her confession. The words were explicit and legally binding. I placed the letter into the manila folder alongside the certified DNA results and the genetic charts. I possessed the entire arsenal required to secure my family's future and neutralize the threat she posed. I stood up from the booth, buttoning my coat. I did not offer a comforting touch or a final word of reassurance. The transaction was complete. I walked out of the diner, leaving her sitting alone in the fluorescent light. The hostage situation was over-resolved not by a dramatic screaming match, but through precise, undeniable leverage. I had secured the paperwork. Now the slow, bureaucratic reality of the aftermath would begin. The black ink on the legal pad was still drying. I stared at the handwritten retraction letter, absorbing the finality of her confession. Linda sat across the sticky Formica table, her shoulders hunched, her tailored coat looking suddenly too large for her shrinking frame. The arrogant facade she had spent decades perfecting had entirely dissolved. She was a woman staring at the wreckage of her own life, realizing she was holding the matches. She began to weep. This was not the calculated, delicate crying she had used in my kitchen during the blizzard. Those were manipulative tears deployed to elicit sympathy and redirect my attention. These tears were different. This was raw, ugly grief, the kind of sobbing that racks the chest and strips away all dignity. Linda reached across the table. Her manicured fingers trembling violently, she attempted to grab my hand. "Please, Victoria," she gasped, her voice breaking into a ragged, pathetic whisper. "You have to understand. It was such a dark, lonely time. Your father was working on those long haul routes. He was gone for weeks. I was sitting in that massive empty house suffocating. I thought I was going to lose my mind." I looked at her outstretched hand. I did not reciprocate the gesture. I pulled my hand back, resting it safely in my lap. I felt a cold, impenetrable barrier solidify between us. "I understand loneliness, Mom," I replied, my voice devoid of any warmth. "Eric spends 4 weeks at a time navigating the icy waters of Lake Superior. I know exactly what it feels like to sit in a quiet house waiting for a husband to return." I leaned closer, dropping my voice so only she could hear the absolute finality of my words. But my isolation did not lead me into another man's bed. And more importantly, your historical trauma does not give you permission to terrorize my marriage. It does not grant you the right to financially abuse my newborn child. You used my son's college fund as a weapon because you were terrified of your own shadow. Linda withdrew her hand, wrapping her arms tightly around her torso, as if trying to hold herself together physically. She nodded rapidly, unable to formulate a coherent defense. The crushing weight of her own hypocrisy pinned her to the vinyl booth. She recognized the grotesque irony of her actions. The woman who had marched into a hospital delivery room to publicly bastardize my legitimate son was now completely at my mercy to protect the secret of her own illegitimate child. I picked up the manila folder containing the gold-sealed paternity test, the printed genetic charts, and her newly signed confession. I secured the documents, ensuring nothing was left behind. I stood up from the table. "We are done here," I stated, buttoning my coat against the chill of the diner air conditioning. "You will execute the legal transfer of the trust fund tomorrow morning. Do not attempt to contact Eric or his parents. Do not show up at my house." I did not wait for her to agree. The transaction was complete. The terms of her surrender were non-negotiable. I turned and walked out of the 24-hour diner. I pushed through the heavy glass doors, stepping into the freezing Minnesota evening. The cold air hit my face, feeling incredibly clean and sharp after the suffocating tension of the confrontation. I walked to my car, parked under the harsh yellow glow of the streetlights. The hostage situation was over. The immediate threat to my family's financial security and my husband's dignity was neutralized. I had not relied on a dramatic screaming match in a probate courtroom. I had not engaged in a petty public war of words within the church community. I had utilized precise, undeniable data to dismantle her leverage. I started the engine and turned the heater on, letting the car warm up. The victory was absolute, but it did not feel triumphant. I sat behind the steering wheel, watching the diner through my windshield. I could see my mother still sitting alone in the corner booth. Her head bowed, her hands covering her face. She was a broken matriarch trapped in the prison of her own making. I shifted the car into drive and pulled out of the parking lot, heading back toward St. Paul. The operational phase of my strategy was successfully concluded. The legal transfer of the generation-skipping testamentary trust would require a few days of bureaucratic processing, but the outcome was guaranteed. I possessed the documents necessary to compel her compliance. However, resolving the financial blockade did not immediately heal the profound emotional damage inflicted upon my family. Uncovering a 30-year-old secret carries a significant residual cost. I was driving back to a quiet house carrying a burden of knowledge that fundamentally altered the landscape of my entire life. I knew the truth about Lars. I knew the fragile foundation of my parents' marriage. I was the cycle breaker, and being the cycle breaker often means bearing the weight of the truths you choose not to tell. I had secured my child's future, but I had permanently isolated myself from the family unit that raised me. I could never look at my father or my brother the same way again. The dynamic was forever shifted. The next few days would require careful logistical coordination with my attorney to finalize the trust transfer. I had to ensure the bureaucratic mechanics were executed flawlessly, leaving no room for my mother to exploit a legal loophole. I also had to prepare for the inevitable fallout when Linda's signed confession reached the church elders and Eric's parents. The social detonation I had engineered was going to send shockwaves through our tight-knit community, and I needed to brace my own household for the impact. I navigated the dark, slush-covered streets, focusing on the road ahead. The war with my mother was finished, but the silent aftermath was just beginning. The paperwork had protected my family when blood ties failed, proving that organized data is the ultimate equalizer against emotional manipulation. Now I had to oversee the final administrative steps, ensuring the independent fiduciary assumed control of the trust without delay. The legal machinery was ready to engage, and my mother's forced resignation was imminent. The days following the diner confrontation lacked the cinematic flair of a shouting match. There were no dramatic confrontations on a snowy driveway or tears shed in a hospital room. The aftermath of our war was strictly bureaucratic. It unfolded in quiet, carpeted offices through encrypted emails and scanned signatures. That is the reality of neutralizing a threat. True security is not achieved through loud victories. It is achieved through airtight administrative logistics. I contacted Marcus, my family law attorney, early the next morning. I instructed him to draw up the formal demands for Linda to relinquish her role as trustee over my grandfather's estate. Marcus warned me that trustees rarely surrender their positions without a protracted legal fight. He expected her counsel to stall to file counter-motions and to drag the process out for months. I told Marcus to send the demands anyway and wait. I knew something he did not know. I knew my mother was operating under the crushing weight of an ultimatum she could not afford to test. Marcus called me back less than 48 hours later. His measured professional tone carried a rare note of genuine surprise. Linda's attorney had surrendered immediately. There were no counter-motions, there was no negotiation over terms. My mother instructed her legal counsel to capitulate to every single demand we outlined. The transition required a meticulous legal choreography. Linda signed the voluntary resignation forms, dissolving her authority over the generation-skipping testamentary trust. To save whatever fragile scraps of her public dignity remained, she cited deteriorating health reasons on the official probate filings. It was a convenient, socially acceptable excuse. It allowed her to retreat from her responsibilities without explaining the true nature of her abrupt departure. The probate judge accepted the resignation without prejudice, clearing the path for the next phase of our strategy. We transferred the administration of the fund to an independent financial fiduciary located in a sleek glass building in downtown Minneapolis. I wanted the money as far away from my family's emotional volatility as possible. An independent firm does not care about church gossip or petty resentments. They care about legally mandated disbursement schedules and market yields. They operate on data and compliance. Placing the account in their hands permanently secured my newborn son's college fund. The generational wealth my grandfather intended for him was finally locked behind an impenetrable corporate vault. A week after the diner summit, I was sitting at my desk in the operations firm. The chaotic rhythm of supply chain management hummed around me. Phones rang in the background and junior coordinators discussed shipping delays on the warehouse floor. I stared at my dual monitors, reviewing a freight manifest. A new email notification pinged in the corner of my screen. The sender was Marcus. The subject line simply read, "Probate finalization and attachments." I clicked the email open. The body of the message was brief, confirming that the probate court had officially recognized the independent fiduciary. The financial blockade was legally dismantled. I scrolled down to the attached PDF files. The first document was the court order stamped and finalized by the judge. I closed my eyes for a moment. I let out a long, shuddering sigh. The breath rattled in my chest, releasing weeks of stored physical tension. The heavy, suffocating dread that had followed me since the hospital ambush finally evaporated. My son was safe. My husband's dignity was vindicated. I had navigated the storm and anchored my family to solid ground. I opened my eyes and clicked on the second attachment in the email. This was the document I had demanded in the diner. It was a scanned copy of the formal retraction letter Linda was forced to send to the elders of our Lutheran church and to Eric's parents. Reading the letter on my computer screen provided a chilling, profound closure. Linda had written it exactly as I instructed. Her handwriting, usually an elegant flowing script, looked rigid and forced. She addressed the congregation leaders and my in-laws with a formal, stiff greeting. She then dismantled her own lies piece by piece. She explicitly stated that her accusations regarding my fidelity were entirely fabricated. She wrote the words "severe mental health struggles" and admitted to suffering from deep-seated paranoia. She confessed that her erratic behavior at the hospital and her subsequent hostility were the result of a psychological break causing her to project unfounded delusions onto my marriage. She formally apologized for the distress she caused and requested privacy as she stepped away from her church duties to seek medical treatment. The impact of that letter reverberating through our tight-knit community was instantaneous and lethal to her social standing. The women who had dropped off tater-tot hottish and whispered about my character were suddenly confronted with a signed confession of mental instability. The rumors about my marriage evaporated, replaced by hushed, pitying conversations about Linda's tragic decline. She had weaponized the church against me, and now the weight of that same community was pressing down on her. She had voluntarily destroyed her own reputation to keep her 30-year-old secret safe. The woman who prized her flawless image above all else was now the subject of sympathetic prayer circles. She was effectively exiled from the social ecosystem she spent her life trying to dominate. I closed the PDF and leaned back in my office chair, looking out the window at the gray Minnesota sky. The journey had been exhausting and deeply painful, but the conclusion reinforced a fundamental truth I use every day in my career. When blood ties fail you, when the people who are supposed to protect you decide to betray you, data is the ultimate equalizer. My mother tried to use emotional manipulation, guilt, and social pressure to control my life. She relied on the invisible, unspoken rules of family loyalty to force my compliance. But emotional manipulation cannot survive in the face of certified forensic evidence. A printed genetic chart and a verified IP address hold no sentimentality. They are immune to tears and gaslighting. I used supply chain logistics to uncover her lie, and I used legal contracts to bind her to the consequences. The paperwork became the shield that protected my husband and my child. The hostile takeover was thwarted. The war was officially over. I logged out of my workstation and packed my bag, ready to go home to my family. I felt a deep, resounding sense of peace, knowing the legal barriers were firmly in place. Yet beneath that peace, a new quiet anxiety began to simmer. I had neutralized my mother and secured the trust fund, but the radioactive secret I uncovered at the blood drive still existed. The biological truth about my older brother Lars was safely locked away in my mind, but holding a secret of that magnitude requires a constant, vigilant effort. It creates an invisible wall separating you from the people you are protecting. The immediate threat was gone, but the emotional fallout was just beginning to settle. I knew my father Thomas remained entirely oblivious to the dark transaction that had just occurred. He believed his wife was simply stepping down from the trust due to the vague health reasons she cited in the court filings. He thought her sudden withdrawal from the church was a tragic symptom of aging. He did not know that his marriage was a hollow shell. He did not know his namesake son was the product of a betrayal. I had successfully insulated him from the blast radius, but my silence meant I was now complicit in maintaining the illusion of his life. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket as I walked toward the elevator. It was a text message from Thomas asking if he could drop by the house this weekend to see his new grandson. He mentioned that Linda was not feeling up to the trip and he would be coming alone. I stared at the screen, the weight of my victory pressing heavily on my shoulders. I was preparing to welcome my father into my home, knowing I was holding the key to his profound ruin. The legal battle was finished, but the burden of being the family cycle breaker was going to demand a heavy toll during the quiet visits to come. The transition from winter to early spring in Minnesota is often a deceptive process. The snow melts, turning the lawns into muddy swamps, only to freeze solid again overnight. It is a season of waiting, trapped between harsh realities. My life felt similarly suspended. A month had passed since the legal transfer of the trust fund. Eric was back on the Lake Superior freighters, completing a short 2-week rotation. I was home alone with the baby, managing the quiet routines of early motherhood. The dramatic tension of the probate dispute had faded into the background, replaced by a different kind of quiet ache. On a Saturday afternoon, my father Thomas arrived at my house. He drove his old, reliable pickup truck, navigating the slushy neighborhood streets with practiced ease. He walked up the driveway carrying a small cardboard box from a local bakery. He wore his heavy wool coat, the familiar VFW donor pin catching the weak sunlight. I opened the front door and greeted him. We had not seen each other since before the hospital incident. He wrapped me in a tight, warm hug, smelling faintly of sawdust and motor oil. He stepped into the foyer, stomping the slush from his boots. "Where is my grandson?" he asked, his voice rumbling with genuine excitement. I led him into the living room. The baby was awake, lying on a playmat near the radiator. Thomas dropped to his knees, groaning slightly as his joints popped. He lifted the infant into his large, calloused hands, cradling him with a practiced, gentle ease. He bounced my son lightly on his knee, making soft, cooing sounds. The baby stared up at him, his small fists waving in the air. No. Thomas's face glowed with unfiltered pride. He looked at my son with the kind of pure, unburdened love that only a grandparent can provide. Watching him sit on my living room floor, I felt a sudden sharp pang of sorrow. I loved my father deeply. He was a steady, grounding presence throughout my childhood. He worked long hours to keep a roof over our heads and never asked for recognition. Yet, as I watched him smile, I realized the foundation of his entire life was a lie. He was holding my biological son, completely unaware that the man he called his own son, Lars, shared zero genetic connection to him. He was living inside a carefully constructed illusion. I went into the kitchen to brew a pot of coffee and set out the bakery pastries. I needed a moment to steady my breathing. The knowledge I carried felt like a physical weight pressing against my ribs. I poured the coffee into 2 ceramic mugs and carried them back into the living room. Thomas shifted the baby to his shoulder, patting his back with a rhythmic thump. He took a sip of the dark coffee and sighed, staring out the window at the gray sky. "Your mother sends her love," Thomas said softly. His tone lacked conviction. It was a polite societal lie we both knew was necessary to maintain the peace. I nodded, taking a sip from my own mug. "How is she doing, Dad?" Thomas shook his head, his shoulders slumping slightly. "She is struggling, Victoria. She has been deeply depressed lately. She refuses to leave the house. She stopped attending the Sunday services, and she stepped down from the charity committees. She will not even host the hottish suppers anymore." He looked back at this baby, a shadow of worry crossing his features. "I think it is just a difficult phase of aging," he continued, trying to rationalize her behavior. "The doctor said menopause and getting older can trigger severe anxiety and paranoia. She feels so terrible about what happened at the hospital. She claims she was not in her right mind. I try to encourage her to get out and see her friends, but she just sits in the dark all day. It breaks my heart to see her like this." I listened to my father excuse the behavior of the woman who betrayed him. He believed her forged retraction letter. He absorbed the narrative she fed him, blaming biology and aging for her malicious actions. He thought she was suffering from a tragic medical decline. He did not know she was barricading herself inside that house out of pure, unadulterated terror. He did not know she was hiding from the church community because she had formally confessed to being delusional. He did not know she was sitting in the dark, paralyzed by the fear that I might one day tell him the truth about Lars. I looked at my father and felt a heavy, complex sorrow wash over me. The victory I achieved in the 24-hour diner came with a devastating hidden cost. I had successfully protected Thomas from a truth that would have ruined his twilight years. If I had exposed Linda's affair and the subsequent biological reality, it would have shattered his heart. He would have spent his final decades navigating a brutal divorce and mourning the loss of a son he raised. I made the active choice to spare him that agony. I shielded him from the blast radius of my mother's deception. But in doing so, I erected a permanent invisible barrier between myself and my parents' home. I could never sit at their dining table and engage in casual conversation again. I could never look at Lars without seeing the physical manifestation of my mother's betrayal. I was forever alienated from the family unit that raised me. I realized in that quiet living room that being the cycle breaker in a dysfunctional family is not a glamorous, triumphant role. It is a lonely burden. Breaking the cycle often means bearing the weight of the truths you choose not to tell. It means absorbing the toxicity so it does not infect the next generation. It is a messy, imperfect piece. It requires living with a constant low-grade anxiety, knowing you hold the pin to a live grenade. You have to actively choose silence every single day. But as I watched my father gently rock my son to sleep, I knew I had made the right decision. The cost was high, but the return on investment was absolute. My son was safe. His financial future was legally secured in an independent trust fund, away from my mother's grasping hands. My husband's dignity remained intact. The insidious rumors regarding his paternity were dead and buried. More importantly, my son would grow up in a house free from the suffocating shadow of generational paranoia. He would not inherit the toxic legacy of Minnesota niece manipulation. He would not be subjected to the arbitrary cruelties of a matriarch desperate to control her image. My silence purchased his freedom. Thomas stayed for another hour drinking coffee and talking about the upcoming spring thaw. He mentioned Lars was struggling to keep his contracting business afloat, but quickly changed the subject, sensing my lack of interest. When he finally stood up to leave, he carefully handed the sleeping baby back to me. He wrapped me in another tight hug, pressing a kiss to my forehead. "You are a good mother, Victoria," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I am so proud of you." I closed my eyes, fighting back the tears threatening to spill. I held on to him for a long moment, drawing comfort from the simple, honest love he offered. "I am proud of you too, Dad," I replied, my voice cracking slightly. I watched him walk down the driveway and climb into his old pickup truck. He backed out into the street, waving as he drove away. I stood in the doorway, holding my son, the cold air rushing into the foyer. I had protected my father from the monster he married. I had locked the monster in a cage of her own making. The war was over, but the landscape of my life was forever altered. I closed the front door and locked the deadbolt. The house was quiet and safe. I carried my son back to his nursery, laying him gently in his crib. The legal battles were finished, and the emotional fallout was managed. However, the true measure of my victory would not be found in probate records or signed confessions. The ultimate test of our resilience would be how Eric and I navigated our marriage moving forward. We had survived a brutal assault on our foundation, but the experience had fundamentally changed how we viewed the world. As winter finally began to recede, revealing the harsh, scarred earth beneath the snow, I looked toward the future. The massive freighters on Lake Superior were preparing for the spring shipping season, and Eric was coming home. It was time to leave the wreckage of my childhood family behind and focus entirely on the family I was building. The depths of a Minnesota winter offer a specific kind of harsh, isolating beauty. The cold is not merely a temperature, it is a physical presence that forces everyone indoors, shrinking the boundaries of your daily life. The lakes freeze over, and the dense northern forest stands silent under thick blankets of snow. My father's visit had brought a brief thaw to the emotional frost inside our house, but the lingering chill of the confrontation remained. I spent the next few weeks adjusting to the quiet routines of maternity leave, finding solace in the predictable rhythms of feeding and sleeping. Eric returned home from his logistics rotation in early March. The Lake Superior shipping season was temporarily suspended due to heavy ice accumulation, allowing him a rare extended shore leave. His arrival brought a surge of warm kinetic energy back into our home. He walked through the front door smelling of diesel fuel and freezing wind, dropping his heavy canvas duffel bags in the hallway. He immediately scooped our son out of the bassinet, holding him high in the air and laughing as the baby waved his fists. The darkness that had haunted Eric since the humiliating hospital ambush seemed to lift. He was home, and he was ready to reclaim his role as a father. A few days later, we decided to escape the confines of the house. We bundled the baby into a thick insulated snowsuit and strapped him securely into a rugged jogging stroller. We drove out to Duluth, a port city built on steep rocky hills overlooking the vast freezing expanse of Lake Superior. The air coming off the water was sharp and biting, carrying the scent of pine needles and iron ore. We parked near the canal and walked along the paved path bordering the water's edge. The lake was a mesmerizing landscape of shifting ice flows. Huge, jagged chunks of frozen water groaned and ground against each other, pushed by the relentless currents. We stood near the lighthouse, watching the massive 1,000-foot freighters slowly maneuver toward the shipping channel. These iron giants are the lifeblood of the regional economy, carrying tons of taconite pellets from the northern ranges down to the steel mills of the lower Midwest. I watched a particularly large vessel, its red hull scarred by years of service, pushing through a thick sheet of ice. The bow cracked the frozen surface with a deep, resonant boom, sending fractures shooting across the lake. The ship did not rush or panic. It moved with a slow, deliberate, immense power, breaking the obstacles in its path and forging a clear channel. Standing there on the frozen shore, shivering inside my parka, the freighters took on a profound symbolic weight. I looked at the ship and then looked at Eric. He spends his life managing the logistics of those behemoths, ensuring they safely navigate the treacherous unseen hazards hiding beneath the dark waters. He understands the mechanics of momentum and resistance. I realized I had executed a similar navigation over the past 6 months. My mother's polished, polite facade was the surface ice. She operated under the guise of Minnesota niece baking hot dish casseroles and smiling warmly at church functions. To the casual observer, she appeared completely serene. But underneath that frozen exterior lay a dark, treacherous ecosystem of deception, paranoia, and 30-year-old secrets. The currents of her guilt were dangerous, pulling her toward erratic, destructive behavior. When she ambushed me in the delivery room, she attempted to freeze my life, trapping me in her own toxic narrative. She wanted to immobilize my marriage and control my child's future. If I had panicked or tried to fight her with empty emotional outbursts, I would have been crushed against the hull of her social standing. Instead, I acted like the freighter. I did not rush. I relied on my operational training. I gathered the data. I secured the prenatal tests, the IP logs, and the genetic charts. I established the legal framework transferring the trust fund and securing her signed confession. I moved with slow, deliberate, undeniable momentum, cracking the frozen surface of her lies and carving a clear, safe channel for my family. Eric stepped up behind me, wrapping his heavy arms around my waist. He rested his chin on the top of my head, shielding me from the biting wind. We stood in silence, watching the ship disappear into the gray horizon. "It is good to be home," Eric murmured, his voice rumbling against my shoulder. "I hated leaving you alone to deal with her." "You didn't leave me alone," I replied, leaning back into his solid warmth. "We took that first test together. We built the armor before the war even started." Eric nodded, looking down at our son sleeping peacefully in the insulated stroller. The anger and humiliation that had shadowed him after the court-ordered swab were gone. He did not look like a man whose dignity had been stripped by a bureaucracy. He looked like a father who had weathered a brutal storm and emerged stronger on the other side. Our marriage survived the assault because we anchored ourselves to truth and transparency. When the rumors began circulating through the congregation, we did not let the whispers breed suspicion between us. We faced the threat as a unified front. We refused to let another generation's toxic secrets dictate our reality. We broke the cycle of deception by choosing honesty even when it was excruciatingly painful. The wind picked up whipping snow across the paved path. I tightened my scarf and Eric grabbed the handle of the stroller. We turned away from the lake and began walking back toward our truck. The legal battles were officially behind us. The financial threat was neutralized. My mother was effectively neutralized, trapped in a prison of her own making. Yet a lingering question remained unanswered. I had secured my immediate family and protected my father, but I had not addressed the final casualty of my mother's deception. My older brother Lars was still navigating his life completely unaware of his true biological origins. He was still struggling to keep his contracting business afloat, desperate to earn the approval of a man who was not his actual father. I had chosen to keep the secret to protect Thomas, but carrying that knowledge created a profound moral tension. I knew the truth could destroy Lars, but I also knew that living a lie is a slow, insidious poison. As we drove back toward St. Paul, the heater blasting in the cab of the truck, my phone vibrated in my purse. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a text message from Lars. We rarely communicated outside of formal family holidays. The message was brief and out of character. He asked if he could meet me for coffee next week. He said he needed to talk about something important regarding Mom and Dad. I stared at the glowing screen, the anxiety returning with a sharp jolt. The carefully constructed peace I had fought so hard to build was suddenly fragile again. I had assumed my mother's forced isolation would contain the fallout. I had not anticipated Lars seeking me out. If he was asking questions about our parents, it meant the cracks in their marriage were becoming visible. It meant my mother's frantic attempts to hide her secret were failing. I gripped the phone tightly, my thumb hovering over the keypad. The data I possessed was a weapon that could obliterate his world. I had to decide if I was going to maintain the protective silence or if I was going to hand my brother the key to his own destruction. The final remaining ghost of my mother's legacy was knocking on my door, and I had to choose how to answer. The transition from winter to spring in Minnesota is a slow, hesitant process. The snowbanks recede into the saturated earth, and the gray skies finally yield to a pale, clear blue. 6 months had passed since my mother stood in the delivery room and tried to rewrite my reality. I agreed to meet my older brother Lars on a mild Tuesday morning. We chose a quiet, independent coffee shop in St. Paul, far away from the suburbs where our parents lived. I walked through this glass door, bracing myself for a difficult confrontation. I assumed Lars wanted to interrogate me about the trust fund transfer. I thought my mother had finally spun a lie, convincing enough to turn him against me. I found him sitting in a corner booth, nursing a dark roast coffee. He looked different. The frantic, arrogant energy that usually defined him was gone. He looked grounded and profoundly exhausted. I slid into the booth across from him. I kept my guard up, waiting for the accusations. Instead, Lars reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He slid it across the wooden table. He told me that he and his wife were preparing to start a family. They wanted to be responsible about their health history, so they ordered a pair of popular commercial genealogy kits to screen for hereditary markers. They swabbed their cheeks and mailed the plastic vials to a laboratory in California. When the email notification arrived, Lars logged into the online portal. He expected to see a breakdown of his Scandinavian and German heritage. He did not expect to see a list of genetic relatives that excluded our father. Lars looked at me, his eyes bright with a quiet grief. He explained that the database matched him with a first cousin he had never met. He followed the digital breadcrumbs, utilizing the same logical deduction I use in my operations career. He traced the lineage and realized the man who raised us shared 0 genetic material with him. He discovered the biological discrepancy on his own through a simple consumer website. I sat in the booth stunned. I had spent months agonizing over how to carry the burden of this secret. I had paced my living room floor carrying the weight of my father's bliss and my brother's identity. I thought I was the only person standing between my family and ruin. I did not realize the data had already found another way into the light. Lars told me he drove straight to the Lexington house and confronted our mother. He laid the printed genealogy results on her kitchen counter and demanded the truth. Stripped of her social armor and cornered by undeniable science, Linda fractured. She broke down sobbing and confessed to the affair she hid for 30 years. My brother gripped his coffee mug, staring down at the dark liquid. He told me he finally understood our mother's toxic behavior. He realized her relentless favoritism toward him was not genuine maternal love. It was a daily payment of guilt. She indulged his failures and financed his contracting business because she was trying to soothe her own agonizing shame. When he looked back at our childhood, he recognized that her harsh criticism of me was a defense mechanism. She punished my independence because it highlighted her own trapped, deceitful existence. I asked him what he planned to do about our father. Lars shook his head, a sad, definitive gesture. He made the exact same choice I had made months earlier. He decided that Thomas is his father in every measurable way that matters. Thomas taught him how to throw a baseball. Thomas sat in the freezing bleachers during high school hockey tournaments. Thomas built the foundation of his life. Lars refused to shatter the heart of a loyal man just to punish our mother. He chose to protect our father by keeping the biological truth buried. But Lars drew a severe, unyielding boundary. He told Linda she was no longer welcome in his home. He fired her as the unofficial bookkeeper for his business. He severed the toxic financial and emotional ties she used to control him. He revoked her access to her golden child. The twist of fate was breathtaking. I had prepared to defend myself against my brother, assuming he was an adversary. Instead, the truth united us. We sat in that coffee shop, bound by a shared silent duty to protect the man who raised us. We became partners in managing the fallout of our mother's deception. The poetic justice of the situation is staggering. Think about the mechanics of my mother's strategy. Linda tried to use the tight-knit Lutheran community to isolate me. She attempted to leverage church gossip and passive-aggressive polite behavior to bastardize my legitimate son. She wanted to exile me from the family unit to protect her own pristine image. Look at her reality today. She sits alone in her immaculate Lexington house. She honors the boundary I set out of pure terror that I will expose her to the probate court. She honors the boundary Lars set out of pure terror that he will expose her to our Father. She cannot attend Sunday services because she was forced to mail a written confession of her own mental instability to the church elders. She is effectively exiled from the social circles she prized above all human connection. She has not met my son. She will not meet Lars's future children. She is trapped in a quiet suburban prison with a husband she betrayed, living every single day with the terrifying knowledge that both of her children hold the key to her total destruction. She built a fortress of lies, and now she is locked inside it alone. I did not win this war by playing the role of a ruthless villain. I did not engage in screaming matches on the front lawn. I did not stoop to spreading counter-rumors or seeking petty revenge. I won by managing the data. I relied on forensic facts, certified laboratory results, and operational logistics. I protected my peace by refusing to negotiate with delusions. When someone launches an irrational, unfounded attack against your character, it is rarely about you. Projecting guilt is the loudest confession a person can make. My mother's obsession with my husband's shipping schedule was a direct reflection of her own sins committed in an empty house decades ago. She handed me the map to her ruin simply by pointing her finger at me. To anyone navigating a similar storm, my advice is simple and clinical. Trust your instincts when the narrative feels wrong. Remove the emotion from the equation and organize your paperwork. Document the discrepancies. Keep the receipts, the emails, and the intake forms. When toxic family members try to manipulate your reality, do not argue with their feelings. Present the math. Present the data. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and the people you are trying to protect is to legally and systematically dismantle a toxic delusion. You have the right to secure your boundaries and defend your own peace. Thank you for walking through this journey with me. Be sure to organize your files, trust the process, and I will see you in the next story. We are all architects, quietly and constantly constructing the invisible houses in which our families will live. In American culture, where the pursuit of success and respectability is woven into the very fabric of our society, the blueprints for these unseen homes are rarely drawn from the soul. Instead, they are handed to us by community expectations. We are taught that a thriving traditional family requires a well-manicured lawn, a respectable standing in the local church, children who meet our highest expectations, and an image that looks flawless from the street. But what happens when the foundation of that house is poured from ego rather than truth? What happens when a family's walls are insulated with secrets rather than warmth? The story of Victoria Linda and their fractured family is far more than a dramatic tale of DNA tests, logistics, and legal maneuvering. It serves as a profound modern allegory holding a mirror up to the current state of parenting in our society. It reveals the devastating emotional and spiritual toll that occurs when we prioritize external image over internal truth, and it offers a vital curriculum for anyone raising children today. At the heart of this narrative is the terrifying danger of the unhealed shadow. Linda's relentless, cruel attack on her daughter's fidelity in that hospital delivery room was not born of spontaneous malice. It was born of a suffocating, unhealed guilt. In psychology, we refer to this as projection, the act of taking the parts of ourselves we are too ashamed to face and casting them onto someone else. Because Linda could not confront the reality of her own 30-year-old infidelity, her mind sought relief by superimposing her exact sin onto her daughter. For parents, the lesson here is stark and urgent. We must possess the moral courage to heal our own wounds so we do not force our children to carry them. When parents harbor deep resentments, secret shame, or unfulfilled dreams, those hidden shadows inevitably bleed into how they raise their kids. If you find yourself irrationally angry, overly critical, or deeply suspicious of your child, you must pause and look inward with profound emotional awareness. Ask yourself, am I seeing my child clearly, or am I looking at a reflection of my own unresolved pain? Cultivating wisdom as a parent begins with radical self-honesty. Our greatest spiritual duty is to sweep our own internal house clean, ensuring our children never have to breathe the dust of our buried secrets. Furthermore, this story exposes the tragic illusion of the perfect image. Linda was trapped by the intoxicating drug of social standing. It is dangerously easy in our culture to confuse our inherent human worth with our reputation, how we are perceived at Sunday service, our standing in the neighborhood, or the curated perfection we project to the world. Linda weaponized the cultural politeness of her region to protect a fabricated image, sacrificing her actual flesh and blood daughter on the altar of public opinion. We must actively divest from the idolization of external validation. A truly successful traditional family is not one that looks unblemished to the neighbors. It is one where truth, safety, and unconditional fairness reside behind closed doors. When a parent cares more about what the community thinks than what their child feels, the family suffers a profound moral bankruptcy. We teach our children morality not by appearing perfect, but by demonstrating that authenticity is infinitely more valuable than popularity. We must show them that it is safe to be imperfect, safe to be messy, and safe to be real. This narrative also sheds light on the subtle toxicity of guilt-based parenting. As the story unfolded, it became clear that Lars, the undisputed golden child, was not favored out of pure, unburdened affection. He was favored out of his mother's agonizing, unspoken guilt. Linda overcompensated, enabling his failures and shielding him from natural consequences because she was frantically trying to soothe her own conscience. This dynamic ultimately left Lars struggling and emotionally adrift until he discovered the truth on his own. True love within a family cannot be rooted in compensation. When we parent out of guilt, whether because of a past mistake, a divorce, or simply working too many hours, we do a profound disservice to the children we are trying to protect. We rob them of the resilience that comes from facing life's natural consequences. Fairness in parenting means loving your children for exactly who they are, holding them accountable, and never using them as instruments to balance your own internal karmic ledger. Victoria and Lars emerge as the true heroes of this narrative because they chose to become the cycle breakers. Society often conditions us to believe that family loyalty means endless self-sacrifice. We are told to absorb toxic behavior, to keep the peace at all costs, and to forgive without requiring accountability. But Victoria and Lars practiced what we might call fierce compassion. They did not seek petty revenge or engage in public chaotic screaming matches. Instead, they utilized firm boundaries, logic, and undeniable truth to permanently disarm the toxicity. We must cultivate resilience in our children by teaching them the holy act of boundary setting. Protecting the traditional family structure does not mean allowing yourself to be destroyed by the people who share your bloodline. Sometimes the most profound act of love is a firm, unwavering no. We must teach our children that defending their peace, their energy, and their own future families is a sacred right. By demonstrating how to calmly and systematically dismantle manipulation, we equip them to navigate a complex world with quiet, unshakable strength. If you find yourself seeking the warmth of honest narratives, and if stories that explore the hidden depths of human relationships and the hard, necessary truths of family life resonate with you, please take a moment to subscribe to Sofia Told Stories. We are dedicated to sharing narratives that challenge, heal, and reflect the realities of our lives, and we would be deeply honored to have you walk this journey with us. As we close the book on Victoria's journey, we are asked to look at the foundations of our own homes. Are we building our families on a bedrock of truth, or are we constructing fragile fortresses of secrets and social posturing? The greatest gift you can give your children is your own healing. Strip away the need to appear flawless. Drop the heavy armor of ego and societal expectation. When you choose to live in the light of absolute truth, you break the chains of generational trauma and free your children to live unburdened lives. Yet the invisible houses we build are complicated structures. You can patch the cracks, evict the ghosts, and lock the doors against the cold, but the history of the soil remains. When the applause of the neighborhood fades and the lights finally go out in the empty rooms we fought so desperately to decorate, who will be left sitting in the dark with us? Will we be surrounded by a family held together by authentic love, or by strangers bound only by obligation? And more importantly, when the house is entirely silent and we finally look into the mirror, will we even recognize the face staring back?